What if the oldest map in the world wasn't meant to show you where to go, but to warn you where you shouldn't? What if the edges of that map, marked with strange symbols and mysterious lands, weren't imagination at all, but memory of places that once existed and then vanished beneath rising waters or shifting sands? In the British Museum, behind protective glass, rests a fragment of baked clay no larger than your palm. Pressed into its surface sometime around 600 BCE, cuneiform marks describe the world as the ancient Babylonians knew it. But it's the outer edges of this map, the regions beyond the known world, that carry the real mystery. 7 distant lands, rendered as triangular points radiating outward into an ocean they called the Bitter River. Lands with names that translate to darkness, where the sun is not seen, where ancient creatures dwell. Lands that shouldn't exist on a practical map, yet there they are, carefully inscribed as if the cartographer was recording not fantasy, but forbidden geography that someone, somewhere had witnessed and survived. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that map the boundary between the known world and what lies beyond it. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient knowledge stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. In 1899, in a dusty archive of tablets recently excavated from the ruins of Sippar, an ancient Babylonian city northeast of Babylon, a curator at the British Museum noticed something unusual. Among the administrative records and astronomical calculations, one small fragment of clay bore markings unlike anything in the collection. Not a ledger, not a prayer, not a king list, but a circle, carefully inscribed with radiating lines and cuneiform labels that described mountains, rivers, cities, and beyond them all, an encircling ocean and lands that defied explanation. The tablet measured just 12.2 centimetres by 8 centimetres, small enough to hold in one hand, yet it contained what would later be recognised as the oldest surviving map of the world. The clay itself was the pale brown typical of Mesopotamian tablets, baked hard in antiquity, its surface covered in the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script, pressed into wet mud perhaps 6 centuries before the Common Era. The curator who first examined it, working in the dim gaslight of the museum's back rooms, couldn't have known that this fragment would spark debate still unresolved more than a century later. The excavation at Sippar had been conducted by Belgian and British teams working under brutal conditions in the Iraqi desert. They had uncovered thousands of tablets from what was once the great temple library of Shamash, the sun god, patron deity of the city. Most tablets were exactly what you'd expect from an administrative and religious centre: records of grain disbursements, astronomical observations tracking the movements of Venus and Jupiter, omen texts predicting the future based on the appearance of animal livers, contracts for the sale of slaves and property. Standard fare for Mesopotamian archaeology. But this one was different, even before translation. Its visual form set it apart. While other tablets were covered entirely in dense rows of cuneiform, this one had a diagram, a schematic, something that represented space itself. The circle that dominated its surface was drawn with deliberate care, divided by lines that clearly represented rivers or boundaries, dotted with cuneiform labels that the curator could partially read even then. Babylon, Assyria, the Euphrates. This was a map. And it was showing the world as the ancient Babylonians understood it. Imagine the moment of recognition when the tablet was first properly catalogued and examined by Assyriologists who could read its full content. The realization that here, pressed into clay before the rise of classical Greece, before Rome, before the Persian Empire reached its height, was a cosmological statement about the structure of the world. Not just the political world of cities and kingdoms, but the entire world, including regions that lay beyond all known geography, beyond the limits of exploration, beyond the boundaries of what should have been possible for ancient cartographers to know or even imagine. The fragment was catalogued as BM 92,687, and it acquired a name among scholars, the Imago Mundi, Latin for quote one quote. But that name, clinical and academic, doesn't capture what makes this object so unsettling. Because as translation work progressed and scholars began to understand not just the labels, but the accompanying text on the reverse side of the tablet, it became clear that this wasn't simply a symbolic representation of Babylonian cosmology. It was something stranger, something that blurred the line between mythological worldview and practical geography in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The style of the cuneiform, the dialect used, the astronomical references embedded in the text, all pointed to a date in the Neo-Babylonian period, roughly 600 BCE, during the reign of kings whose names we know from other historical sources. This was not some mysterious artifact from civilization's dawn. This was from a period we understand reasonably well, a time when Babylon was a thriving cosmopolitan city, when scholars there were making astronomical calculations of stunning accuracy, when trade networks stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. And yet here was this map, showing things that didn't fit the practical, empirical character of Babylonian science. The map itself follows a logic that feels almost modern in its abstraction. Babylon sits at the centre, rendered as a rectangle along the Euphrates River, which flows from north to south through the clay. Surrounding Babylon in concentric arrangement, 7 cities are marked, their names still legible after 26 centuries: Uruk, Urartu, Susa, Der and others. But it's the outer ring, the quote 2 encircling the known world, that begins to reveal the map's true purpose. The arrangement is precise, almost mathematical. Babylon occupies the centre not just geographically but cosmologically, the axis around which the known world revolves. The Euphrates flows through it like an artery, source of life and civilization. This much aligns with what we know of Babylonian worldview, the idea that their city was the navel of the universe, the point where heaven and earth connected, where the gods had established order out of primordial chaos. The cities surrounding Babylon are positioned with careful attention to their relative locations. Assyria to the north, indicated by text that describes it as a region of mountains and fortifications. Susa to the east, capital of Elam, perennial rival and sometimes conqueror of Babylonian kingdoms. Der, another Elamite city, marked with precision. These weren't mythological places, they were real cities, with real coordinates that Babylonian traders and military expeditions would have known intimately. The triangle used to represent mountains is a convention that appears in other Babylonian schematic drawings, a way of indicating elevation and terrain. The same with the parallel lines used to show canals or marshland. These are cartographic conventions. Methods of translating three-dimensional landscape onto two-dimensional surface. The Babylonians weren't drawing realistic representations, they were creating symbolic diagrams that conveyed spatial relationships and geographical features in a standardized way. What strikes you when you examine photographs of the tablet is how orderly it all appears, how systematic. This isn't the fanciful art of someone imagining distant lands. It's the work of someone trained in technical drawing, someone working within an established tradition of map-making that must have had conventions and standards we're only beginning to understand. The lines are straight where they need to be straight, curved where they need to be curved. The cuneiform labels are positioned clearly, leaving no ambiguity about what each mark represents. But then your eye reaches the outer circle, and everything changes. The bitter river, rendered as a thick band encircling the entire known world, feels less like a geographical feature and more like a boundary marker, a warning. And beyond it, extending outward like spokes from a wheel, those 7 triangular regions that point towards something the map shouldn't contain. The Babylonians called the ocean Maratu, the bitter river, and on this ancient map it forms a perfect circle around the known lands of Mesopotamia and beyond. But this wasn't merely artistic symmetry. To the ancient mind, the bitter river represented a boundary both physical and metaphysical, the edge where the ordered world gave way to chaos, where the familiar dissolved into the unknowable. In Mesopotamian creation mythology, particularly in the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, the universe begins with two primordial waters, Apsu, the fresh water deep beneath the earth, and Tiamat, the saltwater chaos of the ocean. From their mingling, the gods are born, and eventually the god Marduk slays Tiamat and uses her body to create the ordered cosmos. The bitter river on this map is Tiamat's remnant, the salt water that encircles the world of order and separates it from the realm of chaos and monsters. But here's what makes this fascinating from a geographical perspective. The Babylonians weren't wrong to imagine an encircling ocean. From their vantage point in southern Mesopotamia, the known world was indeed surrounded by water. To the south, the Persian Gulf stretched toward the horizon. To the west, beyond the desert, lay the Mediterranean. To the north, the Black Sea and Caspian Sea formed barriers beyond which lay lands they knew only through distant trade and rumour. The idea of an encircling ocean wasn't pure mythology, it was an extrapolation from observed geography. What's remarkable is that later Greek geographers, working independently or perhaps building on knowledge transmitted through Persian intermediaries, developed the same concept. The idea of Oceanus, the world-encircling river, appears in Homer and later in the geographical theories of Anaximander and Hecataeus. Did they arrive at this conclusion independently, or did fragments of Babylonian geographical knowledge filter westward through trade routes and philosophical exchange? The bitter river on the Babylonian map is rendered with parallel lines, suggesting waves or current, a visual representation of moving water. The cuneiform text on the reverse of the tablet describes this water as bitter, not just because of its salt content, but because it's hostile to human life, difficult to navigate, full of dangers both natural and supernatural. This wasn't water you sailed across for trade or exploration. This was water that marked the limit of the survivable world. And yet the text also suggests that this water could be crossed, that there were ways, dangerous and rarely attempted, to journey beyond the bitter river to the lands that lay in the outer darkness. The instructions are fragmentary, damaged by time and the tablets breaking. But what survives speaks of distances measured in the enormous numbers, of navigation by stars that aren't visible from Mesopotamia, of preparations that sound more like religious purification than practical journey planning. Think about what it meant to draw a map that included regions beyond the edge of the world. This wasn't decorative. The Babylonians didn't waste clay on frivolity, didn't bake tablets that served no purpose. Every cuneiform document had a function, whether administrative, religious, educational, or archival. So what function did this map serve? Who was meant to use it, and for what purpose? Radiating outward from the bitter river, 7 triangular regions extend into the void beyond the map's edge. Each triangle is labelled in cuneiform, though time and damage have rendered some inscriptions fragmentary. The surviving labels speak of places where distances are measured in impossible terms, where darkness persists, where strange beasts dwell. These weren't trade destinations or conquered territories, they were something else entirely. The number 7 itself carried profound significance in Mesopotamian thought. 7 gods of destiny, 7 gates of the underworld, 7 winds, 7 stages of the ziggurat. 7 wasn't random, it represented completeness, totality, the fullness of cosmic order. So these 7 regions extending beyond the known world weren't arbitrary additions to the map. They represented the complete set of outer lands, the totality of what lay beyond. Each triangle is positioned with geometric precision, evenly spaced around the circle of the bitter river, suggesting that whoever created this map was working from a systematic understanding of geography, not just marking random directions. North, northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest, west, northwest, perhaps. though the tablet's damage makes it impossible to be certain which triangle corresponds to which direction. But the evenness of their distribution suggests intentional planning. The triangular shape itself is significant. In Babylonian schematic drawings, triangles represented distant mountains or distant lands elevated above the flat floodplain of Mesopotamia. These outer regions were imagined as mountainous, perhaps because mountains represented the boundary between earth and sky, between the human realm and the realm of the gods, or perhaps because travellers who had ventured to the edges of the known world reported back that beyond the deserts and plains, in every direction eventually, you encountered mountains. The cuneiform labels on these triangular regions use vocabulary that doesn't appear in standard Babylonian geographical texts. Some words are archaisms, linguistic fossils from earlier Sumerian that the Babylonian scribes preserved even though the language had long since died as a spoken tongue. This suggests the map was copying information from much older sources, perhaps from Sumerian-era geographical knowledge that predated Babylon itself by 1,000 years or more. Where the labels remain legible, they describe attributes rather than place names. Quote, of Author 4. Quote. Quote. 6. These aren't the sort of labels you'd find on a practical trade map. You wouldn't tell a merchant caravan to head toward where the stars are strange, but you would include such information if you were creating a cosmological diagram, a representation of the world's structure meant to convey mythological or astronomical knowledge, except the text on the reverse of the tablet complicates this interpretation, because there, in the damaged but partially readable cuneiform, are what appear to be distance measurements and travel times to these outer lands. Measured in Baru, the Babylonian unit of distance equivalent to roughly 10 kilometers, or a 2-hour journey, the text describes journeys of 40 Baru, 50 Baru, numbers that would place these lands hundreds of kilometers beyond the known world, but still within the realm of theoretical travelability. The first of these distant regions carries a description that translates roughly to, quote, 8, not a poetic metaphor for death or the underworld, but a geographical claim. Scholars have debated whether this refers to the far north, where polar night occurs, or to some other phenomenon the Babylonians encountered or heard described by travellers who had journeyed beyond the limits of the known world. The cuneiform is explicit here. The full text reads something like, quote 9, quote, the verb used for quote 10, quote, is the same one used in astronomical texts to describe the rising of stars and planets. This is technical language, the vocabulary of observation, not myth. Could the Babylonians have known about polar regions where, during winter months, the sun remains below the horizon for extended periods? It seems impossible. Mesopotamia lies at roughly 33 degrees north latitude, and even the northern reaches of Assyria don't extend much beyond 38 degrees. To experience true polar night, you'd need to travel to 66 degrees north latitude or beyond, well into what's now Scandinavia or northern Russia. That's thousands of kilometers from Babylon, across terrain and cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamian civilization in the 6th century BCE. And yet, here's what makes it complicated. We know the Babylonians received trade goods from extraordinary distances: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from Central Asia, amber from the Baltic, jade from East Asia. These materials travelled along trade routes that spanned continents, changing hands dozens of times, passing through cultures and kingdoms that kept their sources secret to maintain monopolies. But along with goods came information, stories, descriptions of distant lands. What if someone, somewhere along those trade routes, had travelled far enough north to experience polar night and had described it to traders who eventually transmitted that information back to Mesopotamia? The description would have been fragmentary, distorted by multiple retellings across language barriers, but the core claim that there exist lands where the sun doesn't rise for extended periods might have survived the journey and found its way onto this map. Alternatively, some scholars have suggested that, Where the sun is not seen might refer not to latitude but to something else entirely. Deep caves, underground chambers, places where daylight never penetrates but where people or creatures somehow dwell. Mesopotamian texts describe the underworld, the realm of the dead, as a place of darkness beneath the earth, but those texts use different vocabulary, different grammatical constructions. This map label doesn't read like underworld mythology, it reads like geographical description. Or consider a third possibility, that the phrase describes not perpetual darkness, but rather lands obscured by something in the atmosphere, by fog or volcanic ash or smoke, from fires so vast they darkened the sky. Ancient texts from various cultures describe periods when the sun was dimmed or hidden, sometimes attributed to catastrophic events. Massive eruptions or impacts that threw debris into the upper atmosphere and caused what we now call volcanic winter. If such an event occurred in a distant region during a period when travellers were present to witness it, the memory might have been preserved as a geographical feature, a land where the sun disappeared. The mystery deepens when you realise that the same map fragment contains astronomical references on its reverse text, calculations involving the position of Venus, notes about the rising of Sirius, observations about the length of daylight at different times of year. The scribe who created this map was working with astronomical knowledge, understanding celestial mechanics well enough to track planetary movements and stellar positions. This wasn't someone prone to recording fantasy as fact. This was someone trained in empirical observation, in the careful recording of what could be measured and verified. So when that same scribe labels a region on the map as a place where the sun is not seen, and provides distance measurements to reach it, and positions it systematically among other outer lands, what are we to make of that? Was it mythology they recorded with the same care they recorded astronomical fact? Or was it geographical information they believed to be true, based on reports they considered reliable, even if those reports described phenomena that seemed impossible from the perspective of Mesopotamian experience? Another triangle is labelled with text describing a place where a winged creature dwells, accompanied by additional text suggesting this being a tax travellers. The cuneiform is precise, technical, as if recording observed fact rather than mythological fancy. What creature? What traveller returned to tell of it? The map offers no answers, only the certainty that whoever inscribed it believed this information worth preserving. The exact cuneiform reads, when translated literally, something like, a winged creature that seizes the traveller who approaches. The word used for winged is the same term that appears in astronomical text to describe meteors or comets, celestial objects that move across the sky. The word for seizes appears in legal contracts when describing the arrest or detention of persons, a concrete action verb, not the mythological language used for demons or protective spirits in religious texts. In Mesopotamian art and mythology, winged creatures were common. The lamassu, those magnificent human-headed winged bulls that guarded palace gates. The Anzu bird, a divine storm creature that stole the tablets of destiny. Countless demons and protective spirits depicted with wings in cylinder seals and relief sculptures. But those beings have specific names in cuneiform, specific mythological identities. This map label doesn't use any of those names. It simply describes a winged creature in neutral observational language. What makes this particularly intriguing is the addition that this being, quote, 16, not, quote, 17, a holy place. Not a particular god, but actively attacks or captures people who enter its territory. This suggests a geographical hazard, something travellers needed to be warned about, like marking a map with quote 19 or quote 20. The Babylonians had plenty of experience with real geographical hazards, desert tribes that raided trade caravans, mountain passes where avalanches occurred, river crossings where crocodiles lurked. They marked those dangers on route maps and in merchant guides. So was this winged creature a real biological entity that inhabited some distant region beyond the Bitter River? Some scholars have suggested it might describe enormous birds of prey. Species like lammergeiers or griffon vultures that could have been encountered in high mountain regions and would indeed attack or threaten travellers, particularly if defending nesting sites. These birds have wingspans exceeding 2.5 meters, powerful enough to kill large animals by dropping them from great heights onto rocks. To someone unfamiliar with such creatures, encountering them in a remote mountain region would be terrifying. Others have proposed that the description might refer to large bats, species like flying foxes with wingspans of up to 1.5 meters, found in tropical regions far from Mesopotamia. If traders from the Persian Gulf region travelled south along the coast of Arabia, or even across to East Africa or India, they might have encountered such creatures and brought back descriptions that seem fantastic to audiences in Babylon who had never seen bats larger than the small insectivorous species native to the region. But there's another possibility that the text itself hints at. The fragment is damaged right after the description of the winged creature, but traces of additional cuneiform suggest there was more information, possibly describing the appearance of this being in more detail, or specifying its location more precisely. What survives is frustratingly incomplete, like trying to understand a photograph when 3/4 of it has been torn away. The mystery isn't just what the creature was, but why it deserved a place on a map alongside geographical features and distant lands. If this were purely a mythological diagram, you'd expect all 7 outer lands to be populated with divine beings and supernatural phenomena. But they're not. Some labels describe purely geographical features, darkness, distance, unusual astronomical phenomena. The winged creature stands out precisely because it's the only one that describes an entity, a being, rather than a place or condition. What makes this map so haunting is its dual nature. On one hand, it's clearly cosmological, representing the Babylonian understanding of the world structure with Babylon at the axis mundi, the cosmic centre. On the other hand, the precision of the known world, the accurate placement of cities and rivers, suggests the cartographer was working from practical empirical knowledge. So which is it? Mythology or geography? The question becomes more complex the deeper you examine the tablet. The known world, the interior of the circle, is rendered with remarkable accuracy for its time. Babylon is positioned correctly along the Euphrates. The river's course from north to south matches reality. The relative positions of cities like Uruk, Susa and Assyria correspond to their actual geographical relationships. This isn't fantasy geography. This is someone who knew the landscape, who had access to accurate information about distances and directions. The inclusion of Urartu, the kingdom in the mountainous regions of what is now Armenia and eastern Turkey, is particularly telling. Urartu was a real political entity, well documented in both Babylonian records and their own inscriptions. It flourished in the early 1st millennium BCE and had extensive diplomatic and military interactions with Assyrian and Babylonian kingdoms. Placing Urartu on the map demonstrates the cartographer was working with contemporary political geography, not ancient mythological landscapes. The same with Susa and Elam. These weren't legendary cities from primordial time, they were thriving urban centres in the 6th century BCE when this map was created. Susa was the capital of the Persian Empire at various points, a city where administrative archives were kept, where royal proclamations were issued, where actual diplomatic negotiations took place with Babylon. This is historical geography, the kind of information you'd need for military campaigns or trade missions. And yet, surrounding this practical empirical core is the bitter river, and beyond it those 7 mysterious lands with their impossible attributes. It's as if 2 different kinds of knowledge were fused onto a single document. The tension between them creates something unique in ancient cartography, neither purely practical nor purely mythological, but somehow both at once. Perhaps this dual nature reflects something fundamental about how the Babylonians understood the world. They didn't separate mythology from geography the way modern minds tend to. The gods dwelt in real temples in real cities. The underworld was accessed through actual physical locations, caves and crevices where offerings were left. The boundary between natural and supernatural wasn't a philosophical abstraction, but a geographical one, marked by the bitter river that you could theoretically sail across if you were brave enough or foolish enough to try. In this understanding, a map that showed both the known world and the mythological realm beyond wasn't contradictory. It was comprehensive. It showed the totality of existence, from the streets of Babylon where merchants haggled over grain prices to the outer darkness, where the sun disappeared and winged creatures seized the unwary. Both were equally real, equally part of the world's structure, equally deserving of careful documentation. Sippar, where this tablet was discovered, was one of the most important religious and scholarly centres of ancient Mesopotamia. Dedicated to the sun god Shamash, the city housed vast libraries of cuneiform tablets covering astronomy, mathematics, omens, and sacred texts. When excavations began in the late 19th century, thousands of tablets emerged from the ruins, many dealing with calculations of celestial movements and the recording of distant lands. The city's location on the Euphrates River north of Babylon made it a crucial node in trade and communication networks. But its real significance was religious and intellectual. The Temple of Shamash, called Ibabar, meaning the shining house, was one of the oldest continuously operating religious institutions in Mesopotamia, with origins stretching back to the early 3rd millennium BCE. Shamash was the god of the sun, but also of justice, truth and divination, the deity who saw all things beneath his light and rendered judgments accordingly. This association between solar worship and the preservation of knowledge wasn't coincidental. The temple libraries at Sippar functioned as repositories of learning, places where scribal schools trained new generations of cuneiform experts, where astronomical observations were compiled and analysed, where historical records were copied and maintained. The priests of Shamash were scholar priests, literate specialists who served religious functions but also acted as the intellectual elite of Babylonian society. When Belgian archaeologist Hormuzd Rassam excavated Sippar beginning in 1881, working under extraordinarily difficult conditions in the Iraqi desert, he uncovered what he called, quote, 22 room after room in the temple complex yielded thousands of cuneiform documents, many still in the positions where they had been shelved or stored when the city was abandoned in late antiquity. The tablets had been baked hard by fires that destroyed the temple, ironically preserving them far better than sun-dried clay would have survived. The range of texts discovered was staggering. Mathematical tablets with complex multiplication tables and geometric problems, astronomical diaries recording the positions of planets over decades, medical texts describing symptoms and treatments, literary works including copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh and other mythological narratives, legal documents recording everything from property sales to divorce settlements. And interspersed among all this practical and religious material, tablets dealing with geography, with descriptions of distant lands, with knowledge of the world beyond Mesopotamia's borders. Many of these geographical texts have never been fully published or translated. They sit in museum storage, catalogued but not studied, waiting for scholars with the time and expertise to work through them. What they contain, what additional information they might provide about Babylonian understanding of distant lands, remains largely unknown. The map tablet, catalogued and eventually studied, represents just one piece of a much larger geographical knowledge system that the Sippar library preserved. Other tablets from Sippar describe trade routes to Dilmun and Magan, the distant lands along the Persian Gulf. Some contain what appear to be distance measurements to various foreign cities, recorded in Beru and other Babylonian units. Others include descriptions of foreign peoples, their customs, their languages, their gods. This was a culture deeply engaged with the world beyond its borders, maintaining detailed records of geographical knowledge gained through centuries of trade, warfare, and diplomatic exchange. The context in which the map tablet was found matters because it tells us this wasn't an isolated curiosity, but part of a systematic effort to understand and document the world's geography. The Sippar scholars weren't creating fantasy maps. They were compiling geographical knowledge with the same rigour they applied to astronomical calculations or legal precedents. If they included outer lands beyond the Bitter River on their world map, they had reasons, sources, information that made such inclusion seem necessary and appropriate. The map fragment has text on its reverse side, partially damaged but still partially legible. This text appears to describe distances and directions to these outer lands, measured in beru, a Babylonian unit roughly equivalent to 10 kilometers. The instructions are methodical, specific, as if someone was meant to use this information, not for conquest or trade, but for something the text calls, quote, 23. The reverse text begins with what seems to be a title or heading, though the first few signs are broken off. What survives translates approximately as, quote, 24, quote. This is followed by a series of numbered instructions or waypoints, each giving a distance and a directional indicator. The beru measurements range from 40 to 70, suggesting total distances of 400 to 700 kilometers beyond the Bitter River's boundary. But here's where it gets strange. The directional indicators don't use the standard Babylonian terms for north, south, east, and west. Instead, they reference star positions toward the rising of the constellation of the Bull, where the wagon star reaches zenith, following the path of Sirius. These are astronomical directions, navigation by celestial rather than terrestrial landmarks. This is the kind of navigational language you'd use for sea voyages or desert crossings where no familiar landmarks existed, where only the stars provided orientation. The text includes other curious details, instructions to bring specific offerings, though the list is partially damaged. References to quote 28, suggesting this journey was meant to be undertaken at a particular time in the lunar cycle. Warnings about quote 29, quote, which might refer to extreme salinity or perhaps hot springs or geothermal features encountered in certain distant regions. One passage that remains partially intact describes provisions needed for the journey. Quote 30, quote, this isn't mythological language. This is practical journey planning, the kind of supply calculation any Mesopotamian merchant would make before undertaking a long expedition. 40 days of grain suggests a journey lasting at least 80 days round trip, possibly longer if the destination required an extended stay. The phrase, the journey beyond, appears 3 times in the surviving text, always in the same grammatical construction, as if it were a technical term, a specific type of expedition recognized in Babylonian culture. But no other cuneiform texts we've discovered use this exact phrase in this way. It's unique to this tablet, suggesting either that this was specialized knowledge restricted to certain groups, or that most texts describing such journeys haven't survived. There's also a puzzling reference to those who return versus those who complete, implying that some travellers on this journey came back without reaching the final destination, while others went all the way to wherever these outer lands were located. The text seems to acknowledge that both outcomes were acceptable or expected, not that failing to complete the journey was shameful or problematic. This suggests the journey's purpose wasn't simply to reach a destination, but to undertake the journey itself, perhaps for religious or initiatory reasons. To understand what the Babylonians meant by distant lands, we have to acknowledge what they knew was real. Sumerian and Babylonian texts frequently reference 3 distant regions: Dilmun, Megan, and Meluha. These weren't mythical. Dilmun is identified with modern Bahrain, Megan with Oman, and Meluha likely with the Indus Valley. The Sumerians traded with these places, knew their geography, brought back their goods. Dilmun appears in Sumerian texts as early as the mid-3rd millennium BCE, described as a land of fresh water springs, date palms, and precious copper. Archaeological excavations on Bahrain have confirmed this identification, revealing extensive ancient settlements, burial mounds, and evidence of copper smelting and trade. Dilmun wasn't imagination. It was a real trading partner, a stopping point on maritime routes connecting Mesopotamia with lands farther east. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Dilmun as a paradise, a land of immortality where Utnapishti, the flood survivor, dwells after being granted eternal life by the gods. But other texts describe it more prosaically as a source of copper, carnelian, ivory, and exotic woods. Trade records detail shipments of goods from Dilmun, payments made to merchants who sailed there, contracts for the construction of boats capable of making the journey down the Persian Gulf. This dual identity, mythological paradise and practical trade destination, shows how the Babylonians could hold both concepts simultaneously without seeing contradiction. Magan, identified with the region of Oman and the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, was another well-documented trade partner. Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe Magan as a source of copper, diorite stone used for statuary and building, and various precious materials. Archaeological surveys in Oman have discovered extensive ancient copper mining operations, some dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE, confirming that this region was indeed a major source of copper for Mesopotamian civilizations. Expeditions to Magan were significant undertakings. Maritime trade down the Persian Gulf required specialized boats, navigational knowledge, and willingness to spend months away from Mesopotamia on dangerous waters. But the rewards were substantial enough that such journeys were routine during periods of political stability and economic prosperity. Royal inscriptions from Akkadian and Ur-the-Thirst periods boast of ships from Magan docking at Mesopotamian ports, bringing tribute or trade goods to kings who controlled the trade networks. Meluhha is more mysterious but still clearly real. Most scholars identify it with the Indus Valley civilization, the Bronze Age culture centered on cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Mesopotamian texts describe Meluhha as the source of carnelian beads, ivory, exotic woods including ebony, and various precious stones. Archaeological evidence from the Indus Valley shows clear trade connections with Mesopotamia, including Indus Valley seals found in Mesopotamian sites and Mesopotamian artifacts found in Indus Valley contexts. The distance to Meluhha was enormous, over 2,000 kilometers by sea from the Persian Gulf coast to the Indus Delta. This wasn't casual trade. This required organized expeditions, probably involving multiple vessels lasting many months, dealing with unfamiliar languages and cultures. Yet Mesopotamian merchants made these journeys repeatedly over centuries, established trade protocols, developed relationships with Indus Valley trading centers. What's crucial to understand is that the Babylonians distinguished clearly between these real distant lands and whatever the outer regions beyond the Bitter River represented. Dilmun, Magan, and Meluhha appear on the interior of the world map, within the known world, not among the 7 mysterious triangular regions extending beyond. The cartographer knew the difference between far but reachable trading partners and something else, something beyond even those distant shores. So if the Babylonians had practical knowledge of lands as distant as the Indus Valley, what were these other regions marked on the map? The triangular lands beyond the Bitter River aren't Dilmun or Magan. They're something else. The text describing them uses different vocabulary, different tone. The known lands are described with commercial and political language. These outer regions are described with words that suggest danger, strangeness, prohibition. When you examine cuneiform texts dealing with Dilmun or Magan, the language is transactional and matter-of-fact. Ships from Dilmun brought copper weighing 3,000 minas. The merchant Ea Nasir purchased carnelian from Meluhha for the temple of Shamash. Grain shipments to Magan departed in the month of Abu. This is the language of commerce, of routine trade, of known quantities and established relationships. There's no mystery here. no sense of the forbidden or the dangerous beyond normal maritime risks. But the outer lands on the map are described with entirely different vocabulary. The cuneiform terms used translate to concepts like, quote, 37, quote, 38, quote, 39. These aren't commercial terms. They're warnings, prohibitions, suggestions that these regions existed in a different category of geographical knowledge than practical trade destinations. You could go to Dilmun and return with copper, but these other places, if you went there at all, the text seems to suggest you might not come back. There's a grammatical construction in Akkadian, the language of Babylonian cuneiform, that indicates a permanent state versus a temporary condition. When describing the outer lands, the tablet consistently uses the permanent state construction, as if the attributes of these places, their darkness or their strange creatures or their distance, weren't occasional features but essential, unchanging characteristics. This is the same grammatical form used to describe the nature of the gods, eternal and unchanging. It suggests these lands weren't subject to the normal fluctuations of human geography, but existed in some fixed, immutable condition. Another distinction appears in how distances are measured. For known lands like Dilmun, distances are given in practical terms: how many days of travel by boat, how many beru of overland journey, which rivers to follow, and where to make portage. But for the outer lands, distances are given in what seems like astronomical measurements, references to star positions and celestial arcs. As if the journey to reach them wasn't purely terrestrial, but involved some kind of navigation that required astronomical knowledge beyond normal wayfinding. The word that appears repeatedly in connection with these outer regions translates awkwardly into English as something like quote 40 or quote 41. It's a term that appears in religious texts to describe sacred precincts that ordinary people are forbidden from entering, spaces reserved for priests or gods. Applying this terminology to geographical regions suggests these lands were understood as prohibited not by human law, but by something more fundamental, cosmic boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Yet the map includes them, marks them carefully, provides at least fragmentary directions to reach them. This paradox, forbidden yet documented, dangerous yet mapped, suggests the Babylonians understood these regions occupied a liminal category between the knowable and the unknowable. Places that existed but shouldn't be approached except under specific circumstances or by specific individuals with proper authority or preparation. In the same archive where the map was found, archaeologists discovered multiple versions of the flood narrative, most famously preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but also recorded in earlier Sumerian texts. These stories describe a world before the flood, cities and lands that were utterly destroyed, knowledge that was lost. What if the map's outer regions are memories of those lost places preserved in cartographic form? The flood story wasn't unique to Babylon. Versions of it appear in Sumerian tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE, more than 1,000 years before the map was created. The Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian king list, all describe a catastrophic deluge that destroyed the antediluvian world and forced humanity to begin civilization anew. These weren't seen as myths in the modern sense, but as historical accounts, records of real events that had reshaped the world. The Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating documents from ancient Mesopotamia, divides history into two epochs, before the flood and after the flood. Before the deluge, it claims, kings ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years each, from cities that no longer existed in recognizable form. Then came the flood, and afterward, kingship again to new cities, with rulers whose reign lengths, while still exaggerated, were at least within plausible human lifespans. 5 cities are named as having existed before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. Some of these, like Eridu and Sippar, continue to exist after the flood and were known to the Babylonians, but others seem to have been completely destroyed or abandoned, their locations uncertain. their remains buried so deeply beneath accumulated silt that even ancient excavators couldn't locate them with certainty. Archaeological evidence supports the idea of catastrophic flooding in southern Mesopotamia during the mid to late 4th millennium BCE. Excavations at sites like Ur and Kish have revealed thick deposits of water-laid silt separating earlier occupation layers from later ones, suggesting major flood events that might have inspired or reinforced the flood narratives preserved in cuneiform texts. Whether these were local floods or something more widespread remains debated, but the physical evidence confirms that devastating inundations did occur in Mesopotamian prehistory. What if those flood events didn't just destroy cities but actually altered geography on a massive scale? The Persian Gulf's coastline has changed dramatically over the past 10,000 years, as sea levels rose after the last glacial period. What is now the shallow northern Persian Gulf was dry land during earlier periods, potentially supporting settlements and even cities that were permanently submerged as melting ice sheets raised ocean levels. Could some of the map's outer lands represent memories of this drowned landscape? The Sumerian creation myths describe the world emerging from primordial waters, land rising from the abyss through the action of creator gods. But they also describe lands that sank back beneath the waters, places that existed temporarily during the early ages of the world, but were reclaimed by the ocean. If such memories were preserved in Babylonian geographical knowledge, they might be represented on the map as regions that still existed in some sense, beyond the Bitter River, in the oceanic realm that surrounded the world. Another possibility emerges from the flood narratives themselves. Several versions describe the flood hero being granted a special dwelling place after the deluge, a land removed from normal human geography, where he lives with his family in a kind of eternal paradise. This land is described as being, quote, 43, quote, beyond the normal world, in a region that humans cannot ordinarily reach. What if the map includes this location as one of its outer lands, a place that existed in Babylonian cosmology as both mythological and geographical? In the Gilgamesh epic, the flood survivor Utnapishtim dwells in a distant land, quote, 44, quote, beyond the waters of death, in a place where he has been granted eternal life by the gods. Gilgamesh's journey to find him is described in geographical terms, crossing real deserts and mountains, then entering regions that defy normal reality. Could one of the map's triangular lands represent this place? Gilgamesh's quest to find Utnapishtim and learn the secret of eternal life forms the climactic section of the epic. The journey is described with remarkable specificity at first. Gilgamesh crosses the wilderness beyond Uruk, travels through the cedar forest, crosses mountain ranges, encounters the scorpion people who guard the mountain pass where the sun rises. All of this follows a recognizable geographical progression, moving from familiar Mesopotamian landscape into increasingly remote terrain. But then the journey transforms. Gilgamesh enters a tunnel through the Mountain of the Sun, travelling in complete darkness for 12 double hours, a Babylonian unit of time representing 24 hours total. This underground passage brings him to a garden of jewels, where trees bear fruit made of precious stones, where carnelian grows like berries, and lapis lazuli forms leaves. This is clearly no longer realistic geography, but the text continues to use geographical language, distances and directions, as if the journey could be mapped even through this fantastical landscape. Beyond the jewel garden, Gilgamesh reaches the tavern keeper Siduri, who dwells at the edge of the ocean, the waters that surround the world. She warns him that no mortal has ever crossed these waters, that the passage is guarded by the waters of death, which destroy anyone who touches them. But she reveals that Urshanabi, the ferryman of Utnapishtim, can transport travellers across using special stone objects that allow passage without touching the fatal waters. The crossing of the waters of death takes Gilgamesh and Urshanabi a month and 15 days, an enormous journey across an ocean that should, by any reasonable geography, be crossable in far less time if it's simply the Persian Gulf or any known body of water. This suggests they're travelling not just across physical distance but across some kind of cosmic boundary, from the world of mortals to the realm where immortals dwell. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, the location is described as the mouth of the rivers, a phrase that appears in multiple flood narratives. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the rivers were thought to originate from the cosmic ocean, flowing from the realm of the gods into the human world. The mouth of the rivers would therefore be the point where these cosmic waterways emerged from or returned to the divine realm, a boundary zone between human and divine geography. This location isn't described as entirely separate from the physical world. It exists, sot, quote, Fortiusfern. The normal world, across the ocean, but it has geographical coordinates. It can be reached through a journey that involves real distances and real navigation. Utnapishtim describes the land around his dwelling, mentions the fields he maintains, the animals that live there. It's simultaneously mythological and geographical, a place that exists on the boundary between the two categories. Could this be what one of the map's triangular regions represents? A land beyond the bitter river where certain special individuals, granted divine favour, could dwell in a state between mortal and immortal, in geography that was both real and unreal simultaneously? The Babylonian mind didn't necessarily see contradiction in such a concept. If the gods could grant immortality to Utnapishtim, they could equally grant him a dwelling place that existed outside normal geographical constraints while still being mappable in some cosmological sense. The Babylonians were master astronomers, tracking celestial movements with precision that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Their star catalogues and planetary observations were remarkably accurate, but some tablets describe stars and constellations, quote, beyond the ecliptic, in regions of the sky associated with the North Pole. Could the map's distant lands be terrestrial correlates to these celestial regions? Babylonian astronomy was fundamentally practical, developed to serve astrological prediction, calendar calculation, and the timing of religious festivals. But in pursuing these practical goals, the Babylonians developed observational techniques and mathematical models of remarkable sophistication. They could predict lunar eclipses, track the retrograde motion of planets, calculate the length of the solar year to within minutes of accuracy. This wasn't mysticism. This was empirical science conducted with remarkable rigour over many generations. The ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun through the sky over the course of a year, formed the fundamental reference system for Babylonian astronomy. The zodiacal constellations that lay along this path were carefully mapped and named. The motions of the moon and planets were tracked relative to these reference stars. The entire system was geocentric and ecliptic-centred. Viewing the cosmos from the perspective of an observer standing on the flat earth of Mesopotamia, watching the heavens wheel overhead. But the Babylonian star catalogues didn't limit themselves to the ecliptic. They also recorded stars in the northern and southern extremes of the sky, constellations that circled the celestial poles and never rose or set from the Mesopotamian latitude. Some tablets specifically describe stars that never enter the underworld, stars that remain visible all night, every night throughout the year because they're so close to the north celestial pole that they never sink below the horizon. These circumpolar stars occupied a special category in Babylonian astronomical thought. They weren't part of the regular celestial machinery that produced omens and seasonal markers. They were fixed, eternal, unchanging in their positions relative to each other while the rest of the sky rotated around them. Some texts associate these stars with the dwelling places of the gods, eternal realms beyond the cycle of rising and setting that govern the rest of the cosmos. One particularly intriguing astronomical text from roughly the same period as the map describes the stars of the place that is 7, using the same number, 7, that appears in the count of outer lands on the map. This text describes regions of the sky in the far north, near the celestial pole, where groups of stars form patterns associated with distant divine realms. The connection might be coincidental, but the parallel is striking. 7 regions in the sky, 7 regions on the map, both associated with remoteness and divine or cosmic significance. The Babylonians understood that the sky looked different from different latitudes. Travellers returning from distant lands reported that the pole star appeared higher or lower in the sky, that different stars became circumpolar, that constellations visible in Mesopotamia disappeared below the southern horizon or vice versa. This knowledge was incorporated into their astronomical models, with some texts explicitly discussing how the sky's appearance changed as you moved north or south. Could the map's outer lands represent the terrestrial locations where the sky would appear as it did in these unusual astronomical descriptions? Places so far north that the sun disappeared for extended periods during winter, where the pole star stood nearly overhead, where stars that never rose in Mesopotamia would be circumpolar. Or places so far south that entirely different constellations appeared, stars unknown to Babylonian observers, celestial geography that matched the strangeness of the terrestrial geography. Mesopotamian trade networks extended thousands of kilometers, following the Tigris and Euphrates, crossing to the Mediterranean, reaching down the Persian Gulf, traversing mountain passes into Anatolia. Merchants returned with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, obsidian from Anatolia. But some tablets reference expeditions that went beyond return, ventures that didn't come back, journeys from which only rumours and fragmentary stories survived. The scale of Mesopotamian trade during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE is often underestimated. This wasn't isolated city-states engaging in the local exchange. This was a vast commercial network spanning from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley, from the mountains of Iran to the coasts of Arabia. Goods moved along these networks in both directions, and with them moved ideas, technologies, stories, and knowledge. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone prized for jewellery and decoration, came from a single source, the mountains of Badakhshan in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. This is more than 2,500 kilometres from Babylon as the crow flies, much farther by any practical overland trade route. Yet lapis appears in Mesopotamian sites dating back to the 4th millennium BCE, indicating that trade connections to this distant source were established very early and maintained over millennia. The journey to obtain lapis would have been extraordinary. Multiple merchant intermediaries, each controlling a segment of the route. Caravan travel through mountain passes at elevations over 4,000 meters. Crossing territories controlled by various kingdoms and tribal groups, each demanding payment or tribute for passage, months or even years away from home. Yet merchants made these journeys repeatedly because the profits justified the risks and hardships. Similarly, obsidian, volcanic glass used for tools and ceremonial objects, came from Anatolia, hundreds of kilometers to the north and west. Tin, essential for bronze production, came from sources in Central Asia, or possibly even further afield. Cedarwood came from the mountains of Lebanon. Copper came from Oman. Each of these trade goods required organized expeditions to distant lands, knowledge of routes and conditions, relationships with foreign peoples. But some cuneiform texts hint at trade ventures that went beyond even these established long-distance networks. Fragmentary commercial records mention expeditions that were outfitted but never returned, merchant associations that sent ships or caravans to unknown destinations and received no word back. These aren't described as losses to bandits or shipwrecks, but as journeys that quote 52 or quote 53 phrasing that suggests the ventures went too far, pushed into territories from which return wasn't possible. One particularly fragmentary text from the archives of Ur describes an expedition sent to find the source of certain precious stones, gemstones that appeared occasionally in trade goods from the Far East, but whose origin was unknown. The text lists the goods provided for this expedition, the number of men who participated, the boats constructed for the journey, then nothing. The next reference, several tablets later in the archive, mentions that no word has returned from those who sailed beyond Meluha, implying they had passed beyond even the Indus Valley into regions unknown to Mesopotamian geography. Another text, badly damaged but partially reconstructed, describes what scholars call the Expedition of the Star Seekers, a group sent out during the reign of an Thru king to reach the place where the sky meets the waters. The purpose seems to have been astronomical or cosmological, to determine if certain theoretical predictions about the shape of the world and the movements of celestial bodies could be verified by observation from extreme distances. The expedition is mentioned in the initial planning documents, then never referenced again in surviving texts. Were these failed ventures, lost to hazards of travel, or did they succeed in reaching destinations so remote that return was impossible or impractical? Did some merchants and explorers push beyond the known trade networks into territories that the map represents as those outer triangular lands, places from which travellers didn't return not because they died, but because they found something that kept them there? In museum collections around the world, Sumerian and Babylonian cylinder seals depict scenes of daily life, religious ceremonies, mythological events, but a small subset of these seals show landscapes that don't match Mesopotamian geography. Mountains of unusual shape, rivers flowing in impossible directions, vegetation that doesn't match any known climate. Were these purely imaginative, or were the seal cutters working from descriptions of real places travellers had seen? Cylinder seals were among the most common artefacts produced in ancient Mesopotamia. Small stone cylinders carved with intricate scenes that, when rolled across wet clay, left continuous impressions used to mark ownership or authenticate documents. Thousands upon thousands of these seals survive in museum collections, depicting everything from kings receiving tribute to farmers harvesting grain to mythological battles between gods and monsters. Most are entirely conventional, showing scenes that would have been familiar to any Mesopotamian observer. But among the tens of thousands of catalogued seals, a small number show scenes that don't fit any recognisable context. One seal in the British Museum, dating to the Akkadian period around 2300 BCE, shows a landscape with mountains that rise in stepped pyramidal forms entirely unlike the rounded or jagged peaks of the Zagros or Taurus ranges familiar to Mesopotamian travellers. The vegetation depicted appears to be tall, straight-trunk trees with foliage concentrated at the top, resembling palms but growing in dense forests on mountainsides where palms couldn't possibly grow. Another seal, held in the Louvre and dating to the Ur Third period, depicts what appears to be a river system with multiple tributaries, but the arrangement is topologically impossible if it's meant to represent real terrain. Rivers flow uphill, tributaries merge and then separate again, and at the centre of the system is what appears to be a whirlpool or vortex with cuneiform signs around it that scholars have struggled to interpret. One reading suggests the place where waters return to the source, but the grammatical construction is unusual. A particularly enigmatic seal from a private collection shows human figures on what appears to be a boat or platform, surrounded by star symbols suggesting night or cosmic space, approaching a triangular landmass that rises from stylized waves. The human figures are shown in poses of reverence or supplication, and on the triangular land stands what might be a tree or a pillar or an architectural structure. The carving is too small to be certain. What's striking is the arrangement. The triangular land surrounded by water, the stars suggesting celestial navigation, the attitude of the approaching figures as if they're reaching something sacred or forbidden. Were these imaginative compositions artistic license taken by seal carvers to create visually interesting designs? Perhaps. But cylinder seals were functional objects, not art for art's sake. They authenticated contracts, marked property, sealed letters and documents. The scenes carved on them needed to be recognisable to serve as identifying marks. A merchant whose seal showed an impossible landscape would have difficulty conducting business if people couldn't remember or recognise the distinctive imagery. This suggests the strange geographical scenes on some seals might have depicted real places, or at least places described in reports that seal owners found credible enough to commemorate on their personal authentication devices. A merchant who had traded with someone who claimed to have travelled to distant lands with unusual mountains might commission a seal showing that landscape, both as a conversation piece and as a way of asserting connection to exotic knowledge or distant trade networks. The dating of these unusual seals is significant. Many come from the 3rd millennium BCE, the Sumerian period, before the Babylonian map was created. They represent a different strand of geographical knowledge, visual rather than cartographic, but potentially describing the same or similar distant regions. If seal carvers in 2300 BCE were depicting strange landscapes, and mapmakers in 600 BCE were marking mysterious outer lands, that suggests a continuity of geographical tradition spanning more than 1500 years. Some seals show combinations of elements that seem to defy any single geographical interpretation. One depicts mountains with snow or ice at the peaks, unusual for Mesopotamian art which rarely showed frozen precipitation, combined with palm trees at the base and what appear to be volcanic vents or geysers shooting steam or water into the air. No single real location combines all these features, unless the seal is showing a composite landscape, summarizing multiple strange geographical features encountered in different distant regions. When scholars examine the cuneiform labels on the map's triangular regions, the vocabulary is peculiar. Some words don't appear in other contexts. Some grammatical constructions are archaic, predating even early Babylonian by centuries. It's as if the cartographer was drawing on very old sources, perhaps copying from earlier maps or descriptions that used dialect or terminology from Sumerian rather than Akkadian, suggesting knowledge passed down from an earlier age. Akkadian, the language of Babylonian cuneiform, had essentially replaced Sumerian as a spoken language by the early 2nd millennium BCE, though Sumerian continued to be used as a scholarly and religious language much like Latin in medieval Europe. By the time the map was created in the 6th century BCE, Sumerian had been dead as a spoken language for over 1,000 years. Yet Babylonian scribes continued to study it, copy Sumerian texts, and incorporate Sumerian terms into their own writings when dealing with religious or ancient matters. The labels on the map's outer lands use a mix of Akkadian and what appear to be Sumerian loanwords or archaic constructions. One label uses a Sumerian word for mountain that doesn't appear in standard Babylonian texts, a term scholars recognize from early dynastic Sumerian inscriptions dating to 2500 BCE or earlier. Why would a Babylonian cartographer in 600 BCE use a word that had been obsolete for nearly 2,000 years? The most likely explanation is that the cartographer was copying from earlier sources, perhaps from Sumerian-era maps or geographical texts that no longer survive in complete form. The Sippar temple library, where this tablet was found, maintained copies of ancient Sumerian texts precisely for this reason, to preserve knowledge from earlier eras. If the library held geographical knowledge from the Sumerian period, the Babylonian mapmaker might have incorporated that information, archaisms and all, into their world map. This raises a fascinating possibility. What if the 7 outer lands weren't Babylonian additions but Sumerian geographical knowledge, information from an earlier age when the world was understood differently, when coastlines and river systems hadn't yet assumed their current forms? When distant lands might have been more accessible or at least more frequently visited than they were by the time the Babylonians drew their map. Some of the archaic vocabulary relates to navigation and distance measurement, using terms that don't appear in later Babylonian texts. One word that might mean something like star measure or heaven distance appears in a fragmentary context that seems to describe how far one must travel to reach certain outer lands. This term isn't found in any other geographical text, but it does appear in very early Sumerian astronomical inscriptions from Uruk, suggesting it was a technical term from an earlier astronomical tradition. Another peculiarity is the use of what linguists call quote 61 a grammatical structure, where nouns are linked in possessive relationships. The outer land labels use construct chains that are grammatically correct but stylistically archaic. More typical of early dynastic Sumerian than Neo-Babylonian Akkadian. This isn't how a 6th century BCE scribe would naturally write. It's how they would write if they were copying verbatim from much older sources, and preserving the original grammar out of respect for the ancient text, or because they considered the exact wording to be significant. The fragmentary nature of some labels might itself be evidence of copying from damaged sources. If the Babylonian mapmaker had access to an older map or geographical text that was already partially destroyed or illegible, they might have copied what they could read while leaving gaps where the original was damaged. This would explain why some outer land descriptions are complete and detailed, while others are frustratingly incomplete, reduced to a few scattered cuneiform signs that modern scholars can barely interpret. When Greek scholars like Herodotus and later writers described Babylonian knowledge, they often mentioned maps and geographical learning that seemed impossibly detailed for the age. Herodotus himself doubted some claims about the shape of the world, but admitted the Babylonians possessed records going back tens of thousands of years. Were the Greeks exaggerating, or had they seen evidence of knowledge we've since lost? Herodotus visited Babylon in the mid-5th century BCE, roughly a century and a half after the map tablet was created. By his time, Babylon was under Persian control, but its scholarly institutions continued to function, and the temple libraries still maintained their vast collections of cuneiform tablets. Herodotus, always curious about foreign knowledge and customs, would have sought out Babylonian scholars and examined whatever geographical and historical records they were willing to show a foreign visitor. In his histories, Herodotus mentions that the Babylonians claimed to possess astronomical records extending back 470,000 years, a number he clearly finds absurd. He also describes Babylonian maps of the world that showed the Earth as a circular disk surrounded by ocean, with Babylon at the centre, precisely the layout of the map tablet we've been discussing. Herodotus seems to have seen such a map, or at least heard it described in detail by someone who had. But Herodotus also mentioned something else, something that doesn't fit the neat circular world-ocean model. He says the Babylonians spoke of lands beyond the encircling ocean, regions that required special journeys to reach, places associated with astronomical knowledge and the movements of celestial bodies. He doesn't elaborate, perhaps because he didn't understand what his Babylonian informants were telling him, or perhaps because he considered it too fantastical to record in detail. Later Greek geographers and historians, writing in the Hellenistic period after Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, brought Greek scholars into direct contact with Babylonian learning, provide additional tantalizing references. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote a history of Babylon in Greek in the early 3rd century BCE, claimed the Babylonians possessed records from before the flood describing the geography of the antediluvian world, maps and descriptions of lands that no longer existed in recognizable form. Berossus's writings survive only in fragments quoted by later authors, but what remains suggests he had access to authentic Babylonian sources and was attempting to translate their content for Greek audiences. When he describes antediluvian geography, he mentions lands that were later submerged, mountain ranges that were flattened by the deluge, river systems that were entirely rerouted. This aligns with the idea that some Babylonian geographical knowledge described a world that had been transformed by catastrophic events. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, mentions that certain Babylonian texts describe the world as having expanded in size after a great catastrophe, as if the bitter river, the encircling ocean, had once been much closer to Mesopotamia, but had receded outward, revealing new lands that weren't part of the original creation. Strabo treats this as mythological fancy, but he's explicit that the Babylonians presented it as geographical history, not religious cosmology. What's particularly intriguing is that multiple Greek sources mention Babylonian knowledge of quote 62 quote or quote 63 quote, using Greek terminology that seems to translate specific Babylonian concepts. These references are brief, often dismissive, suggesting Greek scholars didn't take the claim seriously. But the consistency across multiple sources spanning several centuries suggests they were all encountering the same Babylonian geographical tradition, a tradition that included knowledge of regions beyond the normal world. Sumerian king lists describe cities and rulers that existed before the Great Flood, some reigning for impossibly long periods. 5 cities are named: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar and Shurupak. After the flood, the texts say, kingship descended from heaven again, but to different cities. If the antediluvian world had different geography, drowned or buried cities in lands now unrecognizable, would a map of the old world show regions that no longer exist? The Sumerian king list is one of the most enigmatic documents from ancient Mesopotamia. It presents itself as a straightforward historical record, listing the kings who ruled the various Sumerian city-states and the lengths of their reigns. For the historical period after roughly 2600 BCE, the king list information generally aligns with archaeological evidence and other historical sources. But for earlier periods, especially before the flood, the numbers become fantastical. Kings are said to have reigned for 28,000 years, or 36,000 years, or even 43,000 years. These aren't typographical errors or damaged text. The cuneiform is clear. The scribes who copied and recopied this text over centuries maintained these enormous numbers, never attempting to revise them into more plausible figures. Why preserve what seems like obvious exaggeration? One possibility is that these numbers represent something other than literal years. Perhaps they're regnal years calculated in a different time system, or they represent dynasties rather than individual rulers, or they encode some kind of astronomical cycle. Scholars have proposed various mathematical reinterpretations that bring the numbers into more plausible ranges, but none are entirely satisfactory. The text seems to insist these were actual reign lengths of actual kings. The 5 antediluvian cities are particularly significant. Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, was located at what was then the edge of the Persian Gulf, though siltation has since moved the coastline many kilometres south. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed occupation layers dating back to the late 6th millennium BCE, making it one of the earliest urban sites in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians considered it the first city ever founded, the place where civilization began when kingship first descended from heaven. Bad Tibera. Larak and Shurupak have been tentatively identified with various archaeological sites, though none with absolute certainty. What's striking is that all 5 cities were located in the far south of Mesopotamia, in the region most vulnerable to Persian Gulf flooding and changes in river courses. If catastrophic flooding did occur in this region during the 4th millennium BCE, these cities would have been most directly affected. Sippar presents an interesting case because it clearly continued to exist after the flood. The king list mentions it as both an antediluvian city and as a major centre in later periods. This suggests that while the flood destroyed or severely damaged the antediluvian cities, at least one was rebuilt on or near its original location. But the text is explicit that the antediluvian city and the later city bearing the same name weren't identical, that there was discontinuity, destruction, and refoundation. If the antediluvian world had genuinely different geography, if the coastline of the Persian Gulf extended much further inland, if river systems flowed in different configurations, if lands that are now underwater were then dry and inhabited, then a map created before the flood would show a world that post-flood observers wouldn't recognize. Those drowned lands might be what the Babylonian map represents as outer regions beyond the Bitter River, places that once existed within the normal world but had been removed from it by catastrophe. This interpretation suggests the map isn't showing the geographical extent of the current world, but rather a palimpsest, layering current geography with memories or records of earlier geography. The inner circle shows the world as it existed in 600 BCE when the tablet was created. The outer triangular lands show regions from an earlier age, preserved in archival sources and included on the map not because they were currently accessible, but because they were historically significant. Sumerian epics describe a distant land called Aratta, beyond 7 mountain ranges, a place of great wealth and wisdom, where precious stones and metals originated. The journey to Aratta is described in one text as taking the messenger through lands of increasing strangeness. Scholars have tried to identify Aratta with locations in Iran or Afghanistan, but the descriptions never quite fit any real geography. Could Aratta be one of the map's outer lands? The Epic of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, one of the longest and most complex Sumerian literary texts, revolves around a contest between Enmerkar, king of Uruk, and the unnamed lord of distant Aratta. Enmerkar wants precious stones and metals from Aratta to build and decorate temples in Uruk. The lord of Aratta demands impossible tributes and challenges in return. The epic is partly a contest of wisdom and magical power, but it's also a detailed description of the geography and the difficulty of the journey between Uruk and Aratta. The messenger, who carries communications between the two cities, must cross 7 mountain ranges, travel through lands of increasing difficulty and strangeness. The text describes the journey in sufficient detail that scholars have attempted to map it, to identify which real mountain ranges correspond to the 7 mentioned in the epic. The most common proposal places Aratta in the region of eastern Iran or western Afghanistan, where the mountain ranges of the Iranian plateau would indeed have presented formidable obstacles to travellers from Mesopotamia. But the descriptions never quite work. The sequence of terrains, the types of obstacles mentioned, the distances implied, none align perfectly with the geography between Mesopotamia and any known candidate location. Some mountain crossings are described as taking longer than entire known trade routes. Some landscape features, like rivers that flow in circles or mountains that move, clearly aren't realistic. And at the end of the journey, Aratta itself is described in terms that sound more cosmological than geographical. Aratta is said to be a place where precious stones line the streets, where lapis lazuli grows from the ground like plants, where the people speak a language so ancient and pure that the gods themselves understand it perfectly. The city is described as being built of precious metals, with temples of gold and silver, with craftsmen whose skills exceed anything possible in Uruk. This sounds like paradise, like the mythological lands of divine dwelling, not a real trading partner. Yet the epic insists on the reality of trade between Uruk and Aratta. Enmerkar sends grain to Aratta, receiving in return lapis lazuli, carnelian and gold. This is practical commerce, not mythological exchange. The quantities are specified, the type of goods detailed. The epic even describes the political negotiations over exchange rates and tribute obligations, the kind of mundane diplomatic and commercial details that wouldn't appear in pure mythology. So which is Aratta? A real place embellished with mythological attributes. A mythological place with some basis in reports of real distant trading centres. Or something more complex, a conceptual place that existed in Sumerian thought as simultaneously real and mythological. A distant land that you could theoretically reach through persistent travel, but whose distance and difficulty of approach made it function practically as the edge of the known world. If Aratta is one of the map's outer triangular lands, that would explain the paradox. It would be marked as beyond the Bitter River not because it was literally across the ocean, but because it was beyond the boundary of normal, accessible geography. A place that existed somewhere in the mountains to the east, but whose exact location and nature remained uncertain. A destination that some merchants or messengers reached and others didn't, whose reports when they came back mixed practical commercial information with descriptions so strange they sounded mythological. In the 20th century, some archaeologists and adventurers, inspired by these ancient texts, mounted expeditions to find evidence of lands described in Sumerian and Babylonian sources. Most found nothing or misinterpreted natural formations as ancient ruins, but a few discoveries, fragmentary and controversial, suggested that the ancient Near East's geography might have been more complex than modern maps indicate, with coastlines and river systems vastly different from today. The early 20th century saw a wave of expeditions attempting to locate legendary cities and lands mentioned in newly translated cuneiform texts. As scholars deciphered more Sumerian and Babylonian tablets, descriptions of distant places accumulated, and enterprising archaeologists and adventurers saw opportunities to make dramatic discoveries that would rival the sensational finds already emerging from Egypt and the ancient Near East. Some of these expeditions were scientifically sound, led by trained archaeologists following rigorous methodology. Others were more speculative, mounted by wealthy amateurs convinced they could succeed where academic caution had failed. The results were mixed, sometimes embarrassing, occasionally intriguing, rarely conclusive. In 1927, a British expedition to the mountains of western Iran claimed to have found evidence of ancient trade routes matching descriptions from the Errata texts. They discovered way stations carved into cliff faces at improbable elevations, thousands of meters above sea level, with cuneiform inscriptions that mentioned the path to the mountain land. The inscriptions were authentic, dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, but they didn't conclusively prove these routes led to Errata or any other specific legendary location. They did demonstrate that Mesopotamian traders penetrated much further into the Iranian highlands than previously documented. Another expedition in the 1930s, this one led by German archaeologists, explored the northern Persian Gulf region using newly available aerial photography. The photographs revealed what appeared to be ancient structures beneath the shallow waters near Bahrain, geometric formations that might represent submerged settlements or harbours. Limited underwater excavation recovered pottery fragments and building stones from depths of several meters below current sea level, suggesting these structures had been constructed when the coastline was different, when sea levels were lower. The implications were significant. If settlements existed in what is now the northern Persian Gulf during earlier periods, when that region was dry land or had different coastlines, then the geography the Sumerians and Babylonians knew was indeed different from what modern observers see. Lands that once existed as inhabitable territory would now be underwater, accessible only to divers and underwater archaeologists, and only if you knew where to look. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, as underwater archaeology developed as a discipline, several teams conducted surveys in the Persian Gulf, looking for evidence of submerged ancient sites. They found scattered artifacts, pottery shards, building stones, occasional bronze implements, all at depths and locations suggesting they came from settlements built when sea levels were lower. But no major cities, no dramatic architecture, nothing that would unambiguously identify a lost civilization or legendary land. The challenge was methodological. The Persian Gulf is shallow but vast, with poor underwater visibility, strong currents, and seabed conditions that make systematic survey difficult. Ancient remains, if they exist, could be buried under meters of sediment, making them invisible to even sophisticated sonar equipment. The technology of mid-20th century archaeology simply wasn't adequate to search thoroughly for submerged sites in such challenging conditions. More recent work using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and advanced sonar has revealed additional tantalizing hints. Surveys conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s identified linear features on the Persian Gulf seabed that might represent ancient river channels, suggesting the Tigris and Euphrates once followed different courses, possibly creating deltas and floodplains in regions that are now deep water. If those floodplains supported settlements, they would be difficult or impossible to locate with current technology. One particularly controversial finding came from a 2004 survey that identified what appeared to be a massive circular formation on the seabed in the northern Gulf, roughly 20 kilometers in diameter, with radial structures extending from a central point. The formation's geometry seemed too regular to be natural, suggesting artificial construction, but the depth and sediment coverage made direct investigation impractical. Some researchers proposed it might be evidence of a very large ancient settlement, possibly even a legendary city mentioned in cuneiform texts. Others argued it was a natural geological feature, perhaps a salt dome or volcanic remnant. The question remains unresolved. The map raises an uncomfortable question for archaeology. What if there were civilizations contemporary with or even predating Sumer that left no trace we've yet recognized? What if some of the map's outer lands represent real places, inhabited by real people whose remains lie beneath risen seas, shifted river deltas, or desert sands we haven't yet excavated? The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially in regions we haven't thoroughly explored. Modern archaeology operates on the principle that absence of evidence, while not proof of absence, is at least suggestive. If no archaeological remains of a supposed civilization have been found despite extensive searching, the working assumption is that such a civilization probably didn't exist. This is reasonable methodology for well-explored regions where decades of systematic survey and excavation have been conducted. But it breaks down in regions that remain largely unexplored or unexplorable with current techniques. The northern Persian Gulf is one such region. Large areas remain unsurveyed, either because they're under territorial waters of countries that don't permit archaeological research, or because the technical challenges of underwater survey and silty, low visibility conditions make systematic work impractical. If settlements existed in this region during earlier periods of lower sea level, we simply wouldn't know unless we happened to stumble across them. Similarly, vast stretches of the Arabian desert have never been systematically surveyed archaeologically. Satellite imagery has revealed thousands of ancient structures and sites in regions previously thought to be empty desert, suggesting that climate and habitation patterns in earlier millennia were dramatically different from today. If some of those structures represent settlements or cities mentioned in Sumerian texts as distant lands, we're only beginning to identify them. The same logic applies to regions of Central Asia, the Iranian Plateau, the Arabian Peninsula, anywhere that ancient trade routes might have reached, but where modern archaeological work has been limited by political instability, difficult terrain, or lack of funding. Absence of evidence from these regions tells us more about the limits of our exploration than about what might actually exist beneath the sand or silt. Recent discoveries keep expanding the known range of ancient civilizations. The Indus Valley Civilization, unknown to archaeology until the 1920s, turned out to be one of the world's largest Bronze Age cultures, with cities as sophisticated as contemporary Mesopotamia and Egypt. If such a major civilization could remain unknown until the 20th century, what else might remain undiscovered? Underwater archaeology has revealed submerged settlements off the coasts of India, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, demonstrating that significant habitation occurred in coastal regions that are now underwater. Each discovery pushes back the timeline of when we think certain regions were inhabited, and suggests that ancient geographical knowledge might have been more extensive than we assumed. The Babylonian map's outer lands might represent exactly this kind of knowledge, information about places that existed and were known to ancient travellers, but whose remains we haven't yet found because we're looking in the wrong places, or using inadequate methods, or simply haven't gotten around to exploring the relevant region systematically. The map might not be showing mythological fantasy, but recording real geographical knowledge that we've lost because the places themselves have been lost to rising seas, shifting sands, or the erosion of time. Among the Sippar tablets, a few fragmentary texts appear to describe return journeys from distant lands, expeditions that brought back strange knowledge, unusual artifacts, stories of what lay beyond. These texts are damaged, incomplete, maddeningly vague, but they share common elements. journeys of many months, passage through regions where the sky looked different, encounters with peoples who didn't speak known languages, and always the bitter river as the boundary that must be crossed going out and crossed again coming back. One tablet, catalogued as part of the Sippar astronomical archive, contains what appears to be a first-person account of a journey to the land where stars stand still. The text is written in the voice of an observer, not in the third-person style typical of official records or epic poetry. The narrator describes sailing across the bitter river for 30 days when the moon was dark, implying a month-long ocean voyage undertaken during the new moon, possibly to facilitate star navigation without lunar interference. Beyond the crossing, the text describes arrival at a land where the sun travels differently, where its path across the sky follows an arc unlike anything observable from Mesopotamian latitudes. The narrator notes that certain stars that rise and set in Babylon remain perpetually above the horizon in this distant land, while other stars, invisible from Babylon, appear in the southern sky. This is exactly what you'd expect from astronomical observations made at significantly different latitude, either far north or far south of Mesopotamia. The fragment continues with descriptions of the local people, their appearance, their customs, their language which the narrator couldn't understand. There's mention of trade goods exchanged, though the list is partially damaged. What survives includes, quote, 70, quote, which might be lapis lazuli or sapphires, and, quote, 71, quote, possibly asbestos, which was known in the ancient world and highly valued for its fire-resistant properties. What's striking is the matter-of-fact tone. This isn't written like mythology or epic adventure. It reads like a traveller's report, meant to document observations for future reference. The astronomical details in particular suggest someone who was trained in observation, who understood what was significant about seeing the sky from a different latitude, and wanted to record those differences precisely. Another fragmentary text describes a return journey that took longer than the departure because of contrary winds. The narrator mentions that provisions ran low, that water became scarce, that members of the expedition fell ill. These are the mundane hardships of ancient travel, not the dramatic perils of mythological quests. The expedition apparently survived and returned to Sippar, where the narrator delivered tablets in unknown writing to the temple archive, along with samples of minerals and plants from the distant land. Did those tablets survive? Are they somewhere in museum collections, catalogued as texts in unknown language, waiting for someone to recognize them as the artifacts mentioned in this return journey account? Or were they lost, destroyed when the temple was sacked, or burned in one of the many wars that afflicted Mesopotamia over the centuries? A third text, even more damaged, describes what it calls the circuit journey, an expedition that apparently attempted to sail completely around the known world by following the bitter river. The fragment is too incomplete to determine if the attempt succeeded, but what survives describes months of sailing, passage by landmarks that can't be identified, encounters with different peoples at various stopping points. The text mentions, quote, 75 quotes suggesting the expedition might have circumnavigated something, perhaps the Arabian Peninsula or some other large landmass. These return journey texts share the bitter river as a constant reference point. Every expedition that ventured beyond the known world had to cross this boundary, going out, and cross it again coming back. The crossing itself was dangerous, requiring astronomical navigation, careful provisioning, proper timing with lunar cycles and seasonal winds, but it was accomplishable. These texts don't treat the bitter river as an absolute barrier, but as a challenging passage that skilled navigators could traverse with proper preparation. Perhaps the deepest mystery isn't whether the outer lands were real, but what it meant to the Babylonian cartographer to place them on a map at all. This was a culture that distinguished clearly between practical geography and mythological cosmology. They had separate genres of texts for each, yet here, on one clay fragment, both coexist. The known world rendered with precision, the unknown world rendered with equal care, as if both deserved the same respect, the same acknowledgement that they were in some sense true. The Babylonians were methodical record keepers. Their cuneiform archives contained thousands of tablets carefully organised by subject matter. Administrative records were kept separate from religious texts. Astronomical observations were distinguished from astrological predictions. Literary works occupied different archive sections from historical chronicles. This was a culture that categorised knowledge, that understood different types of information, served different purposes and required different handling. Yet the map combines what we would consider separate categories. The inner portion is clearly practical geography, usable for understanding political relationships, planning trade routes, comprehending the spatial organisation of the known world. The outer portion seems mythological or cosmological, describing regions beyond practical reach. Why merge these two types of knowledge onto a single document? Perhaps because the Babylonians didn't see the distinction the way we do. For them, mythology and geography weren't separate realms but different aspects of the same reality. The gods dwelt in real temples in real cities. The underworld was accessed through actual geographical locations. The cosmic ocean that surrounded the world was continuous with the real Persian Gulf that lapped at the shores of southern Mesopotamia. There was no hard boundary between mythological space and geographical space, only degrees of distance from the familiar centre. From this perspective, the outer lands weren't a different category of reality, but simply a different region of the same reality, more distant, less accessible, more strange, but not fundamentally different in nature from Babylon itself. They deserved to be mapped because they existed, even if their existence was at the far edge of what was knowable or accessible. To omit them would be to present an incomplete picture of the world's structure. The equal care with which both the inner and outer regions are rendered suggests the cartographer took both equally seriously. The cuneiform labels on the outer triangular lands are inscribed with the same precision as the labels for Babylon and Assyria. The geometric construction of the triangles is as carefully executed as the rectangle representing Babylon. This wasn't casual addition of decorative mythology to a practical map. This was systematic inclusion of outer regions as integral parts of the world's geography. What this reveals about Babylonian consciousness is profound. They possessed a worldview that could hold multiple ways of knowing simultaneously without seeing contradiction. Empirical observation, astronomical calculation, mathematical precision on one hand, mythological narrative, cosmological speculation, ancient tradition on the other. Both were valid forms of knowledge. Both described aspects of reality. Both deserved preservation and study. Modern consciousness tends to separate these categories, to say that science describes the real world while mythology describes human imagination or cultural meaning. But the Babylonians seem to have understood that reality was complex enough to accommodate both empirical fact and meaning-laden narrative, that a map could be simultaneously a practical tool and a cosmological statement. The distant lands could be both geographically real and symbolically significant. The map suggests that ancient knowledge systems were more sophisticated than we sometimes assume. The Babylonians weren't primitive people who confused fantasy with reality. They were rigorous observers and meticulous record keepers who also understood that some truths couldn't be captured through measurement alone, that the world's structure involved dimensions beyond the purely physical, that a complete map needed to show not just what was but also what lay at the edges, in the twilight between the known and the unknown. Today, the Imago Mundi rests in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, catalogue number BM 92687. Visitors pass it quickly, drawn to larger, more dramatic artefacts. But this small fragment of clay, barely larger than a human hand, contains more mystery than objects 100 times its size, because it asks a question that archaeology still can't definitively answer. Did the ancient world know more about the world's geography than we give them credit for, and if so, what happened to the lands they mapped that we can no longer find? The tablet sits in a climate-controlled case, protected from the light and humidity that would degrade the ancient clay. Photography is permitted but difficult because of the protective glass and the positioning of the lights. Most visitors, if they notice it at all, see only a small brown fragment with faint markings. Nothing to compete with the massive stone reliefs from Assyrian palaces or the spectacular artifacts from royal tombs that dominate the Mesopotamian galleries. But if you look closely, if you study the photographs and published drawings, if you read the cuneiform labels and consider what they're describing, the tablet reveals itself as something extraordinary. This isn't just one of the oldest maps in the world. It's a document that challenges our assumptions about what ancient people knew, how they understood the world, what knowledge might have been lost in the long gap between their time and ours. The question the map poses is uncomfortable for archaeology because it can't be easily resolved. We can excavate known sites, catalogue artifacts, translate texts, reconstruct trade networks, map settlement patterns. All of this gives us increasingly detailed understanding of ancient civilizations. But if the map is describing lands that no longer exist in accessible form, or that we haven't yet explored, or that require technologies we haven't yet developed to discover, then the map is evidence of knowledge we can't verify. Some scholars dismiss the outer lands as purely mythological, arguing that the Babylonians simply incorporated their cosmological beliefs into an otherwise practical map. This is the safe interpretation, the one that doesn't challenge established archaeological frameworks, but it requires ignoring the specific technical language used to describe these regions, the distance measurements, the navigational instructions, the return journey accounts. Other scholars take the opposite position, arguing that the outer lands represent real places and that we should take Babylonian geographical knowledge more seriously. This leads to speculation about lost civilizations. Submerged cities, forgotten trade networks, all of which might be true but can't currently be proven. Without physical evidence, without archaeological confirmation, these ideas remain possibilities rather than established facts. The truth might lie somewhere between. Perhaps some of the outer lands were real places, others mythological or cosmological concepts. Perhaps the Babylonians themselves didn't clearly distinguish, understanding their map as describing a world that was simultaneously physical and spiritual, geographical and mythological, knowable through travel and knowable through revelation. What makes the map permanently mysterious is that it presents knowledge we can't fully access. Even with all our modern technology, our satellites and sonar and archaeological methods, we can't definitively say whether the 7 triangular lands represent real places or not. They might be underwater, buried under sand, located in regions we haven't explored, or they might be imaginative constructs. The map doesn't tell us which, and perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the map's deepest truth isn't in what it shows, but in what it asks. It invites us to wonder about the limits of our knowledge, to consider that ancient people might have known things we've forgotten, to acknowledge that the world contains more mystery than our confident modern explanations allow for. It suggests that between the known and the unknown lies a borderland where different kinds of truth intersect, where geography shades into cosmology, where the bitter river both separates and connects the familiar and the forbidden. The map remains, patient as the clay from which it was formed, waiting in its museum case for someone who might understand what those ancient cartographers were truly trying to preserve when they pressed those cuneiform marks into wet mud and baked them hard for eternity. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider the ancient cartographer working by lamplight in the temple of Shamash, pressing wet clay with a stylus, marking the known world and the world beyond. They couldn't have imagined you here thousands of years in their future, tracing the same mysteries they tried to preserve. Yet in a sense, you're both doing the same thing, looking at the edges of what can be known, wondering what lies beyond the boundaries of the familiar. The bitter river they drew still exists in concept, if not in geography, that boundary between what we understand and what remains mysterious. Every age has its own version, its own outer lands that seem simultaneously real and impossible, its own forbidden knowledge waiting just beyond reach. The Babylonians placed theirs on a map and baked it into clay, creating a question that would outlast empires and languages and entire civilizations. Perhaps that's what knowledge truly is at its deepest level. Not answers, but questions that persist across time, connecting minds separated by millennia through shared wonder at the same mysteries. The scribes of Sippar, the Greek scholars who puzzled over Babylonian learning, the archaeologists who excavated the tablet from desert ruins, the curators who preserve it in museum cases, and you, listening now in the dark, all part of the same conversation that began when someone first wondered what lay beyond the horizon and tried to mark it down for those who would come after. The stars those ancient astronomers tracked still wheel overhead, following the same paths they charted with such intensity. The lands they mapped, whether submerged or buried or simply forgotten, rest patient beneath time's accumulation, holding their secrets. And the questions they asked, pressed into clay with such care, still wait for answers that may never come, or may already exist in knowledge we haven't yet recognized. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient watchers knew, under the same sky they measured and mapped. You're connected to them across the centuries, part of the long human story of wondering, watching, and trying to understand the mysteries written in the earth and the heavens. The map will still be there tomorrow, waiting in its case, asking its eternal questions. But for now, there's only the gentle pull of sleep, the soft dissolving of thought into dream, and the comfort of knowing that some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but simply to accompany us, like distant stars. As we make our own journey through the dark, rest now. Let the ancient world hold its secrets while you hold your rest. The bitter river flows between waking and sleep, and it's time to make the crossing.